After weeks of intense military exchanges, Israel and Iran have stepped back from the brink of all-out war. But as the missiles stop flying and the smoke clears, one question remains. What was the true cost of this conflict? The numbers are staggering, and they tell the story of how modern warfare can bankrupt nations in a matter of days. Let's start with the most shocking figure: $1.45 billion. That's what Israel spent in just the first 48 hours of attacks on Iran. To put this in perspective, that's more money than many countries spend on their entire annual defense budget, burned through in 2 days. This translates to approximately $725 million per day in direct military action costs for Israel throughout the conflict. But this figure only tells part of the story. Israel had already spent $67.5 billion by the end of 2024 on its war in Gaza before the Iran conflict even began. The human resource costs were equally devastating. Involving 100,000 reservists every day cost Israel approximately $27 million in direct compensation. But the real economic damage went far deeper, pulling 100,000 people from Israel's crucial high-tech sector, resulting in productivity losses that rippled through the entire economy. Israel's military spending had already increased by a staggering 65% to $46.5 billion in 2024, the highest annual increase since 1967. This represented 8.8% of GDP dedicated to defense, an enormous proportion that was unsustainable even before the Iran escalation. Additionally, the conflict pushed Israel's budget deficit to 6.9% of GDP in 2024, with the country's debt burden reaching 69% of GDP. All three major credit rating agencies had already downgraded Israel's rating before the Iran conflict began, and the additional war spending has pushed the country toward a potential debt crisis. Iran, on the other hand, entered this conflict from a position of severe economic weakness, and the war delivered what can only be described as an economic knockout blow. The most visible impact was on oil exports, Iran's economic lifeline. Before the conflict, Iran was exporting approximately 1.5 million barrels of oil per day, primarily to China. During the war, this collapsed to around 100,000 barrels per day, a 93% reduction that devastated government revenues. To understand the scale of this collapse, consider that Iran was exporting 2.5 million barrels daily in 2012 before sanctions, had recovered to 1.5 million, and then saw it virtually eliminated by the conflict. Iran's military spending had fallen by 10% to $7.9 billion in 2024, but the country had planned a massive 200% increase to prepare for this very scenario. The conflict consumed these resources and more, burning through Iran's limited foreign reserves estimated at $33 billion, much of which remains frozen due to international sanctions. The human cost was immediate. Thousands evacuated Tehran, businesses shuttered, and many Iranians were forced to rely on savings that had already been depleted by years of sanctions-induced poverty. Modern warfare revealed its true cost through Israel's sophisticated defense systems. Each interceptor missile costs between $40,000 and $100,000. And when Iran launched hundreds of missiles and drones in coordinated barrages, Israel's defensive response cost tens of millions of dollars per attack. Iran could force Israel to spend vastly more on defense than Iran spent on offense. A $10,000 drone could trigger the launch of a $100,000 interceptor missile, creating an asymmetric financial warfare model that threatened wealthy nations through sheer volume. The conflict's impact extended far beyond the Middle East. Oil and gas prices rose approximately 25% in the 5 weeks of hostilities, creating immediate inflationary pressures worldwide. The psychological impact was even greater. The mere threat of Iran closing the Strait of Hormuz, through which 1/5 of the world's oil supply passes, sent global markets into volatility. The United States, supporting Israel's military operations, spent at least $22 billion on the conflict, adding to America's fiscal challenges at a time when federal deficits were already at historic levels. The fundamental question throughout the conflict revolved around economic sustainability rather than military superiority. Israel's GDP of over $500 billion compared to Iran's $400 billion suggested greater absolute capacity, but the GDP per capita revealed a different dynamic: $54,000 for Israel versus just $4,400 for Iran. This disparity meant that while Israel had more resources, its population had more to lose economically. Iran's population already adapted to decades of sanctions and economic hardship, demonstrated what economists call anti-fragility, the ability to function under extreme economic pressure. Iran's experience during the 8-year Iran-Iraq war, where over 1 million people died but the economy continued functioning, provided a template for economic endurance that Israel's more prosperous society had never been tested against. As the ceasefire takes hold, preliminary estimates suggest Israel spent approximately $15 to $20 billion on the Iran conflict alone, money that will take years to recover through borrowing and budget adjustments. Iran's losses, while harder to quantify due to limited economic transparency, include the near-complete collapse of oil revenues and the depletion of already scarce foreign currency reserves. Both countries now face the challenge of economic reconstruction while maintaining military readiness for potential future conflicts. Israel must service increased debt levels while maintaining its crucial tech sector competitiveness. Iran, on the other hand, must rebuild its oil export capacity while continuing to circumvent international sanctions. The Israel-Iran conflict demonstrated that 21st century wars are decided as much in treasury departments as on battlefields. Economic endurance significantly influences the duration and outcomes of conflicts, alongside military strategy. The ceasefire did not stem from military exhaustion, but rather from economic reality. Both nations reached the limits of what their economies could sustain in high-intensity modern warfare. In a conflict where daily costs were measured in hundreds of millions of dollars, economic endurance became the decisive factor. The final lesson is sobering. Modern warfare has become so expensive that even brief conflicts can threaten the long-term economic stability of entire nations. The true cost of the Israel-Iran war will be measured not just in the billions spent during active hostilities, but in the years of reduced economic growth, increased debt servicing, and lost opportunities that will follow long after the last missile was fired.